Good day, saints. I trust you're doing well by God's grace. Today we are looking at 2 Samuel chapter 18, and the title for our commentary will be The Grieving King. Considering the previous commentaries, I am assuming you are aware of the state of David the king and Absalom the son's relationship. If not, kindly do give an ear to the previous videos. They are also on this channel. In this chapter, we are introduced to David organizing his army, setting it into 3 divisions under the leadership of Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. And when we look at this, we get to know that David knew the commander belonged out in the battle, probably because he didn't want to repeat his previous mistake of not going to battle when he should have. However, the people surrounding him would not allow him to go out to battle with the rest of his army. The reason being that his life was more valuable, considering that in scripture they say, "You are worth 10,000 of us." He could bring reserves if needed. Scripture says, "You are now more help to us in the city." And I think they understood that it would be hard for David to fight against his own son, Absalom. David could be commended for not being stubborn. He knew how to submit to the good advice of others. He did not give up leadership. He practiced good leadership by listening to the wise advice of the people around him. And also applause to the people who were willing to take on sacrifice and danger for the benefit of their king. Their devotion to David is an example of how the believer should be devoted to the King of Kings, and that is Jesus Christ. And David made it clear that he wanted it known that Absalom was to be kept alive and should not be mistreated in any way. Makes sense. This was his son. Scripture says the woods devoured more people than the sword devoured. This phrase implies that God actually fought for David in unusual ways. Soldiers loyal to Absalom seemed to be swallowed up by the woods. And when we look at Absalom's vanity put him in this battle against the wise counsel of Ahithophel. When you read 2 Samuel 17 from verse 1 to 14. We must say though, Absalom didn't seem like a great general. Who rides a mule into battle? And he was noted actually for his good looks and his luxurious hair. And when you read 2 Samuel 14 from verse 25 to 26, it's crazy though how what was his glory now was his curse. Absalom was literally caught hanging by his own herd in the thick trees of the forest. And this, when it got to Joab, the general, wondered why the men did not immediately kill Absalom. The men replied that it was in obedience and faithfulness to David that he did not do it. So this man actually was like, I know that my king said Absalom, his son, should not be mistreated, like he was to be kept alive. So he was obedient to that word. But Joab had his own reservations, and he insisted that he would give both money and a promotion to the one who killed Absalom, and yet the man would not do it because he was loyal to David the king. Joab didn't hesitate to strike Absalom, though he knew David commanded him not to. Joab was convinced that it was David's best interest and in Israel's best interest to show Absalom justice, not mercy. Absalom was a murderer, he was a traitor and a rapist, So Joab knew that David was generally indulgent towards his children and would never punish Absalom. He had seen David's action toward his sons characterized by lack of discipline. We might say that Joab was correct, but not right. He was correct in the sense that, understanding that it was better for David and for Israel that Absalom was dead, he was not right, though, in disobeying King David, the God-appointed authority over him. By David's dealings with King Saul, we see that God can deal with those in authority, and we don't need to disobey them unless commanded by the scripture or a clear conscience. One may say Absalom got what he deserved, and Joab would be held accountable for what he did to Absalom, both by God and eventually by David. When you look at 1 Kings chapter 2 from 5 to 6. And then later in scripture we see Ahimaaz wanting to take to David the news of Israel's victory and Absalom's death. But Joab wanted to spare him the burden of being the messenger of bad news. Ahimaaz was faster than the other runner, and since he was someone David knew, David assumed it was good news. David asked if Absalom was alive. This was his only concern. He was a father. He should have been more concerned for Israel as a nation than for his traitor son. At the same time, David's question is an example of the great bond of love between a parent and a child, and which also reflects to us and between God, our Father, and his children. There's just that kind of bond that cannot be separated. David was a father, and he loved his own child. It is a father that speaks, and a father's love that can survive the enmity of a son. Children may plunge into the worst of sins, but they are once children still. They may scoff at God. They may tear parents' hearts to pieces with their wickedness. We can take complacency in them, but at the same time, they cannot be unchilded, nor either erase their image from our hearts. They are just children, and parents are parents. Without saying it directly, the Cushite, the other messenger that was sent by Joab, told that Absalom was dead. Scripture says the king was deeply moved. The Hebrew idea of deeply moved implies a violent trembling of the body. David felt completely undone hearing the news of Absalom's death. It could be that he knew that he supplied actually the soil this tragedy grew from. The soil came from David's indulgent parenting. The soil came from David's sin with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah, after which God promised David that the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. That is 2 Samuel 12 from verse 10 to 11. And the soil came from David's own sinful indulgence of his passions and smaller rebellions against God, which sins and weaknesses were magnified in his own sons. And David's sorrow shows us that it isn't enough that parents train their children to be godly. They must first train themselves in godliness. We are to be examples than any other thing. How we handle ourselves, how we bring up our children really reflects so much on our own character. We cannot stand in the presence of that suffering without learning the solemn lessons of parental responsibility. It has to teach, not merely in training our children, but in that earlier training of ourselves for their sake is very important. David mourned so much for Absalom because he really was his son. David saw his sins, his weaknesses, his rebellion exaggerated in Absalom, and everything in the story just leads up to and culminates in this wail of anguish over his dead body. 5 times, literally 5 times, he repeated the words, "My son, my son, my son, my son, my son." This surely had a deeper note in it than that of merely half-conscious repetition of words occasioned by personal grief. The father recognized how much he was responsible for the son. It is as though, like David had said, he is indeed my son. His weaknesses are my weaknesses. His passions are my passions. And his sins are my sins. I feel so bad for David, actually. David wanted to die in the place of his rebellious son. What David could not do, God did by dying in the place of rebellious sins. Many of us have rebelled against God and gone our own ways, and thank God that we were actually redeemed by the dying of Jesus Christ. So, in the cry of David, we actually hear the cry of God for his lost children, his desire to restore us, his desire to forgive. Let's all take it upon ourselves to go back to the Father and do better, because his arms are always open to welcome us. I hope you were blessed by this commentary. See you in the next video. Have a good day.